As I walked through the crowds, I felt the weight of their expectations, their eyes filled with hope and curiosity. They were seeking something, a truth that would illuminate their lives, a kingdom that would transform their destinies. But the kingdom I have come to announce is different from anything they imagine. It cannot be seen, touched, or possessed, but it can change the world from the inside out. Today, once again, I will be challenged to speak of a mystery as deep as the human heart and as vast as the starry sky above us. The wind whispered through the hills as the sun painted the sky with shades of gold and red. The scene appeared peaceful, but I could feel the growing restlessness of the crowd around me. Their eyes were fixed on me, carrying a mixture of hope and skepticism. Men in simple robes, women holding the hands of children, some elderly leaning on staffs, all were searching for something. They wanted answers, signs, changes. They felt overwhelmed by the burdens of Rome, by the religious demands of the Pharisees, by the harshness of life. I walked up to a small rise, where my voice could be clearly heard. I knew they were expecting something extraordinary, something tangible, but the kingdom I was proclaiming was different. It had to be different. A thin man with a stern expression stepped out of the crowd. His voice broke the silence. "Rabbi, what is the kingdom of God?" he asked, directly and boldly. The question hung in the air, echoing in the hearts of those around. I saw their expressions change, curiosity in some, hope in others, and even impatience in a few. They all wanted to hear the answer. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their anticipation. The kingdom of God was not something that could be simply explained, but I knew I needed to plant the right seed. "Whoever has ears to hear," I began, letting the words drift on the wind. "Let them hear." Their expressions shifted again. Some furrowed their brows, others tilted their heads as if expecting more. I left them in that state of anticipation and continued. "The kingdom of God is like a hidden treasure in a field, something that is only found by those who seek it with all their heart." The murmuring among them began, but before the questions erupted, I raised my hand to silence them. "Listen to this story. There was a sower," I began, letting my voice flow like the breeze running over the hill. "He went out to sow his seed. As he sowed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where there wasn't much soil. They sprouted quickly because the soil was shallow, but when the sun came up, they withered because they had no root. Other seeds fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. But some fell on good soil, where they produced a harvest, 160 or 30 times what was sown." The words came naturally, but the expressions on the faces of the crowd were confused. Many whispered to one another, while others shook their heads. A man at the back raised his hand, as if wanting to interrupt. "Rabbi, what does this mean?" he asked, impatient. "Are we talking about seeds or the kingdom?" I smiled slightly, but left the question hanging. "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." I repeated those words, knowing that not everyone there was ready to understand. I let the parable resonate in their hearts as I moved among them. I noticed that some pulled away, murmuring words of frustration. Others seemed intrigued, absorbing each word. It was not easy for them. They expected a clear answer, a manifesto, something they could grasp. But the kingdom of God was not like that. When we moved away from the crowd, the disciples walked in silence for a while, but I could feel they were also unsettled. Their questions would come, and I was ready to answer them, but only at the right moment. As the sunlight disappeared over the horizon, one certainty remained in my heart. Some seeds had already fallen on good soil. The campfire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the disciples' faces. The silence among us was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of insects and the wind blowing through the trees. I knew they were restless, trying to decipher the words they had heard earlier. It was Peter who finally broke the silence. "Rabbi," he began, hesitantly, but with the tone of someone who could no longer hold in his doubts. "Why do you speak in parables? If the kingdom of God is so important, why not say clearly what it means? Wouldn't it be easier for people to understand?" I looked at him and then at the others. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity, frustration, and, in some cases, doubt. I knew they needed clarity, but I also knew they weren't ready to understand everything. The truth required spiritual maturity. To you, I began, my voice calm but firm, has been given the mystery of the kingdom of God. But to those on the outside, everything is said in parables, so that seeing, they may see but not perceive. Hearing, they may hear but not understand. They exchanged confused glances. I knew those words seemed harsh, but they were necessary. Not everyone was ready to receive the truth. Many came to me seeking miracles, political liberation, something that would satisfy their earthly expectations. The kingdom of God was far more than that. The parable of the sower, I continued, observing their reactions, is about the heart of the one who hears. The path represents those who hear but do not understand. The enemy comes and steals what was sown. The rocky ground represents those who receive the word with joy, but have no root. When difficulties arise, they fall away. Among the thorns are those who hear but are suffocated by the worries and riches of this world. But the good soil, I paused, letting my words sink in. The good soil is the heart that hears, understands, and bears fruit. 30, 60, or 100 times more. The disciples remained silent, absorbing my words. I didn't expect everyone to understand at that moment, but I knew the seed had been planted. The next morning, as we walked along a narrow trail flanked by wheat fields, some of the disciples were still deep in thought about the parables. The sun had already begun to warm the day, and the ears of wheat swayed gently in the wind. I saw an opportunity to illustrate once again the mystery of the kingdom of God. Do you want to know more about the kingdom? I asked, stopping and pointing to the field before us. The disciples nodded, attentive. The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, I continued, picking up a small seed between my fingers. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it grows, it becomes the largest of the garden plants, large enough for the birds to come and make nests in its branches. They watched the seed in my hand, their expressions reflecting both fascination and confusion. James, always practical, asked, "But how can something so small represent the kingdom? Shouldn't it be something grand from the beginning, something everyone can clearly see?" "That's exactly what many expect," I replied, my gaze fixed on the field before us. A kingdom that starts grand, visible, powerful. But the kingdom of God is different. It starts small, almost invisible, but it grows until it transforms everything around it. Before they could respond, a group of Pharisees appeared in the distance, walking toward us. I knew their presence would bring more challenges, but also new opportunities to teach. As they approached, one of the leaders, with a stern expression, stared at me. "If you speak of the kingdom of God, where is it? If it is so powerful, why don't we see it? Where is the glory you preach?" His question was a test, an attempt to discredit me. I remained calm and replied, "The kingdom of God does not come with visible signs. You cannot say, 'Here it is' or 'There it is.' For the kingdom of God is in the midst of you." The Pharisee shook his head in disbelief and walked away, but some of his followers remained, intrigued. I saw on their faces that my words had planted something, even if small. As we continued our journey, I felt that, little by little, the kingdom was beginning to sprout in the most unexpected places. The days that followed were marked by rising tension. The crowds continued to grow, but their questions became more insistent, more demanding. Many wanted a visible kingdom, a concrete liberation, something they could hold and call victory. Among the disciples, I sensed a growing restlessness, especially in Peter, whose straightforward temperament often reflected the doubts of them all. That night, gathered around the fire, the silence was broken again by Peter. He spoke with the tone of someone who carried the concern of many. "Rabbi," he said, his voice firm but laden with uncertainty, "if the kingdom of God is so transformative, why keep it a mystery? Why not show the world the power we have? If you perform a miracle that no one can deny, everyone would believe and follow." The other disciples nodded, some with enthusiasm, others with hesitation. James, more cautious, added, "Many are waiting for signs, Master. Wouldn't that be what they need to believe?" I looked at each of them, feeling the weight of their expectations and fears. It wasn't the first time I had faced this question, but I knew I needed to be even clearer with them. "You are expecting a kingdom like the kingdoms of this world," I began, my voice calm, yet filled with conviction. "But the kingdom of God is not built with swords or thrones. It is not something you can point to and say, "Here it is," or "There it is." It starts small, inside of you, and manifests through transformation. Peter furrowed his brow, visibly struggling to accept my words. But what about those who don't understand? What about those who refuse to listen? What will happen to them? My voice grew more solemn as I answered, "Not everyone will accept the kingdom. Many will reject it because their hearts are hardened. But that does not mean we should give up. Our role is to sow, even knowing that some seeds will not grow. For in due time, the harvest will come." As I spoke, I realized that the internal struggle of the disciples wasn't just a matter of understanding. They also carried the fear of failure, the uncertainty of following a path that seemed so contrary to the world's expectations. But I knew this was how the kingdom grew, in the midst of weakness and doubt, like a seed planted in the ground. The next morning, while we rested in the shade of a fig tree, a group of Pharisees approached. Their faces were stern, their steps calculated. I already knew what they wanted: a public confrontation, an opportunity to discredit me before those who followed me. The leader of the group spoke first, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "Rabbi, you speak so much about the kingdom of God, but where is it? Why can no one see it? If it is so powerful, where are the signs confirming it?" The crowd that followed us fell silent, waiting for my response. I knew this was more than a question. It was a challenge. They wanted something tangible, a proof they could use against me, or perhaps, finally, to believe. "The kingdom of God does not come with visible signs," I began, maintaining my firm tone. "You cannot say, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is.' For the kingdom of God is in the midst of you." Some in the crowd murmured, confused by my answer. Others seemed fascinated, as though something had sparked in their minds. But the Pharisee was not satisfied. "If the kingdom is among us, why does the world remain the same?" he asked, his voice filled with disdain. "Why do we still live under the rule of Rome? Why do injustices remain? What is so transformative about this invisible kingdom?" I looked around, at the anxious faces in the crowd. I saw fear in some eyes, doubt in others. But I also saw hope in some faces, and it was to them that I directed my words. "The kingdom of God is like the yeast that a woman mixes into 3 measures of flour," I replied, letting my voice carry the weight of the moment. "At first, it is invisible, but it works from within until the whole batch is transformed." The tension in the air seemed to ease as my words sank in. Some still shook their heads in disbelief, but others seemed to finally begin to understand. The transformation the kingdom brings does not start in external structures, but in the hearts. Later, as we walked together, John approached and asked, "Rabbi, how will we know if we are living in the kingdom of God? How can we recognize it in our lives?" I stopped and looked at him, my heart filled with compassion. "You will recognize it by its fruits, John. Where there is justice, love, and compassion, there the kingdom of God is. But remember, it starts small, within each one of you, and grows until it transforms everything around you." As we continued our journey, I felt that some seeds had finally begun to germinate. Even among the most skeptical, the kingdom was starting to manifest. The day was suffocating, with the sun burning brightly in the cloudless sky. In the square of a nearby village, the crowds gathered around me, some eager to hear more, others waiting for an opportunity to question. I knew the Pharisees were nearby. I could feel their presence, their stares, their intentions. They didn't come just to listen, they wanted to challenge me. As I spoke about the kingdom of God, a Pharisee stepped forward. He had a rigid posture, his gaze sharp like a blade. His voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "If the kingdom of God is among us, as you claim, why has nothing changed?" he asked. "Why are we still oppressed? Why do we continue to suffer under Roman rule and the injustices of the world? Tell us, Rabbi, where is the power you promise?" The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone awaited my response. Some, like the disciples, were beginning to understand that the kingdom was different. Others, like that Pharisee, were looking for something they could measure, control, turn into a symbol of power. "The kingdom of God," I began, my voice calm but firm, "does not come with pomp or circumstance. You cannot say, Here it is or there it is. For the kingdom of God is in the midst of you." He laughed, his expression full of disbelief. Beautiful words, but empty. The world remains the same. Nothing changes. "Tell us, Rabbi, how can this invisible kingdom transform anything?" I walked to the center of the square, letting my gaze sweep over the crowd. "The kingdom of God is like a tree that starts with a seed," I answered. "At first, it is small and insignificant, but it grows to offer shade and shelter to all around it. Or like the yeast a woman mixes into the dough, invisible but transformative." The Pharisee shook his head. "Seeds and yeast." He laughed again, but the sound was bitter. "You promise something no one can see. Your words are just metaphors." I let the silence fill the space. There was power in silence. "And you?" I asked finally, looking directly at him. "Can you see the change in someone's heart? Can you measure the transformation of the Spirit?" The kingdom of God begins on the inside and grows outward, transforming everything around it. You don't see it because you're looking in the wrong place. The crowd was divided. Some murmured in agreement, others remained skeptical. But I saw something in the face of a young woman at the back. Her eyes were shining with understanding. She said nothing, but I could tell she had grasped it. Not everyone needed to understand at that moment, but some were beginning to see. Later, as the heat of the day gave way to the cool evening breeze, I sat with the disciples in a clearing outside the village. The stars began to appear in the sky, and the sounds of nature surrounded us. The confrontation with the Pharisee was still fresh in their minds. They too had doubts, but they were beginning to understand. John was the first to speak, his voice calm but full of questions. "Rabbi, if the kingdom of God is so different from what we expected, how will we know we are living in it? How can we be sure we are on the right path?" I looked at him with a light smile. His sincerity was genuine, and his quest for understanding was what made him fertile soil for the kingdom. "You will recognize it by its fruits, John," I replied. "Where there is compassion, justice, love, and peace, there the kingdom is. It is not something you can build with your hands, but something God plants in your heart." Peter, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke, his voice filled with emotion. "And those who don't accept it, those who reject us and mock us, what will happen to them?" My expression became serious. "Not everyone will accept the kingdom, Peter. Many will reject it because they are not ready to let go of what they have. The kingdom requires an open heart, willing to be transformed. But remember, it is not for you to judge. Your role is to sow, even if not all the seeds sprout. The rest is God's work." They were silent for a moment, reflecting on my words. The glow of the campfire cast shadows on their faces, and I could see the subtle changes in their expressions. Some were beginning to understand the true meaning of the kingdom, while others still carried doubts. But that was to be expected. The kingdom grew at each one's pace. Before we retired to rest, I left them with one final challenge. You will be the bearers of this message. You will take the kingdom beyond these borders, to places you can't even imagine. But remember, the kingdom of God is not about power or glory. It is about transformation. And the greatest transformation begins within you. As I looked at the stars, I felt the peace of knowing that the seed had been planted. The kingdom was growing, invisible but present, waiting for the moment to bear fruit and transform the world.